Horse racing is not a major player in American culture. It's not. Its week-to-week life is often left in the stewardship of college kids, gambling addicts, or the obscenely wealthy in locations that lack the glamour and prestige that this country so desires. It's a vestige of the past that somehow keeps on kicking. Still, every May, so much of our country dons its gaudiest outfits, throws back a couple oddly minty beverages, and gathers around the TV in a way it ever less frequently does to watch the fastest 2 minutes in sports. Why? What makes the Kentucky Derby inherently different from its peers? The great men that stood behind it. Not in the American dream, pedal to the metal, write your own destiny sense. Great men with great patience, who cultivated a reputation, a mystique, over centuries, beginning long before Churchill Downs was even an idea of an idea, that allows Louisville and Kentucky to credibly present themselves as the home of horse racing today. So long ago was the state's first modern racetrack built that the sport predates, well, the state by a clear decade. Sportsman Hill, as it was known, a passion project behind the frontier home of Colonel William Whitley, was revolutionary to American horse racing. Whitley, a Continental Army officer and an avid patriot, insisted on his track standing in total opposition to the norms of England, and thus of the colonies. His races were run counterclockwise, on dirt instead of turf, and the patrons watched from inside the oval instead of on its edges, all of which are still defining characteristics of the sport domestically 2.5 centuries later. Quickly, Whitley's contemporaries moved to build copycat tracks all across Kentucky, accelerating after his death in the War of 1812 and after the formation of the Kentucky Association, who began regulating the sport in 1826. In Louisville, the Hope Distillery, Elm Tree Garden, and Oakland courses counted themselves among the first generation of copycats. Though the former has been lost to time as its parent company went belly up before the doors ever opened, Oakland was widely regarded as one of the finest racetracks in the world. Serene and stately, it was equal parts resort and horse track, with accounts evoking imagery more akin to an equestrian Augusta National than any purpose-built track of today. Inside its clubhouse and around its grounds, much of what we'd recognize as the foundation of Louisville horse racing was laid. Samuel Churchill was its president. It hosted disproportionately high-profile races and counted the days rich and famous among its patrons. It was all a mirage, though. The high-profile races, like 1839's $14,000 matchup between local champion Gray Eagle and world-renowned Wagner, dubbed the greatest race west of the Alleghenies, were gimmicks to try to build a brand. Gimmicks that would sink them. They had no financial footing from which to responsibly pay those purses. They were simply Hail Marys to try to keep the struggling course alive. Facing mounting obligations and waning interest, Oakland, the finest course in Kentucky, went quietly into the night at the end of the 1850s. Woodlawn tried to resurrect the stately image of Louisville's racing scene, opening its doors to much fanfare in 1860, but it too met financial difficulties following the Civil War and shut its doors only a decade later. Even then, when horses were the height of technological innovation, the fastest vessel you could possibly race, interest was fickle and fleeting. Serious concerns arose over the future of Kentucky's famous horse breeding industry. If there was no longer interest in the state, why would its people invest so much of their time and money perfecting the racehorse? Many prominent figures considered abandoning either the practice or the region, hoping they might find better fortune elsewhere. But in 1874, abandoning all logic, they resolved to make one last stand. Well, in truth, one man had resolved to make one last stand. Set alike by the racing he had seen in England and France with his wife's family in 1872, Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. returned to Louisville with a burning desire to replicate the spectacle at home. Not just on the track. At Epsom, Clark witnessed an occasion far exceeding that of a mere horse race. Britain's high society gathered to rub elbows, Parliament adjourned as if it were a holiday, and Londoners poured in by the thousands to join in the reveling. It was a party under the guise of sport, one that attracted people of all backgrounds and piqued his interest in a way nothing ever quite had. He wanted that experience for all of Louisville. A bluegrass aristocrat descended from two of Kentucky's most prominent families, Clark had a plan to do it too. His father, Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., and grandfather, William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, both owned and bred horses on their respective farms, and his maternal grandfather was Oakland's aforementioned Sam Churchill. Thanks to that pedigree, Clark was able to grease the wheels of Kentucky's high society in a way which very few others would have been capable of. In just 1 year, he rounded up 320 shareholders, raising $32,000, around $1 million today, to erect his own racecourse on land, like Oakland, leased from the Churchills, though this time from his uncles rather than his grandfather, and in 1874 they put shovels in the ground. For a time it was uncertain what would become of it. Some wanted shorter racing, some wanted harness racing, some were skeptical it would exist altogether, but with a singular vision, Clark built his masterpiece. And it was a masterpiece. The track was a fast mile, wider than any course in the country, 85 feet on average, with room for over 10,000 patrons. Like Woodlawn, it invoked at least slightly encouraging comparisons to Saratoga, then the nation's gold standard. It even had state-of-the-art betting machines that Clark had stumbled across in Paris, making it a trailblazer among American venues. It was far from what we'd associate with Derby Day now, though. The mile-and-a-half Derby was an also-ran, a sideshow to make up the numbers for Clark's 2.25-mile Louisville Cup that drew nearly twice as many fans. There was one stand, bad drainage, the races were run during the week. On the surface, it was decidedly from a bygone era. Still, its bones, the idiosyncrasies hidden underneath the somewhat crumbling Old South veneer, were eerily familiar. So much of the Derby's iconography traces its lineage to those early days. Its record-setting speed was immediately the subject of national news reporting, thanks to blazing runs from Aristides and Ballanquille. Unseemly as it may seem, wagering, now perhaps the most common theme of the Derby, was even more intense at the time, on occasion bringing men to blows. Clark himself was even said to pass out mint juleps, the most recognizable symbol of the Derby today, in the stands and clubhouse. Still, the venue struggled. It seems totally foreign to us today. It was the Derby. The media knew it was the Derby. It existed much in the same way we consume the Derby, but horse racing just didn't have the spark to keep its own head above the water. The only real money in it was in selling the race winners, and Churchill Downs couldn't put on races with only theoretical profit on offer, none of which came back to them. After a gambling-related revolt in 1887 and several ensuing scandals, the track began a slide into deep financial decline, chewing through the initial investment and several $1,000s worth of Clark's private wealth until it was sold in 1894. New owner William Applegate, with a staggering investment totaling potentially over $100,000, left his own chapter in the Derby's story, introducing roses as a winner's prize, shortening the race to its modern distance, and constructing the towering spires that now adorn Churchill Downs' logo. But he couldn't turn its fortunes either. He might as well have been lighting that $100,000 on fire. Over and over and over, the universe tried to teach Louisville a lesson, and over and over and over, they refused to listen. It was not going to happen, but history has never been made by weak-willed men. Modest entrepreneur Matt Winn, with the backing of Louisville's best and brightest, knew that he could make it succeed, that everyone else was simply thinking too small. It had so long floundered, he thought, because of the narrowness of scope, the inability to see beyond their noses. He loved the Derby, but he didn't want Churchill Downs to be just a sporting venue. He wanted it to be an institution. He wanted it to be somewhere that people associated with unadulterated joy from the days of their adolescence, much as he did. Wresting control as vice president in 1902, Winn set about doing just that. Above all else, he knew that the track needed to be on stable financial ground. Not in 5 years, not tomorrow, now. There was no path to making his beloved race an icon of American sport if they couldn't keep the creditors at bay long enough to build cachet in the racing world. Indeed, that had been a problem for decades. The lack of stability and constant infighting had prevented the Derby from ever taking a step forward from what it was in Clark's early days, much less the gargantuan leap towards the premier stakes races of the day. Other revenue sources were then a must. Diversified revenue sources at that. Winn, a self-made man, wanted to lean even further into the track's cross-class appeal. Through his backers, he raised $20,000, nearly the entire original cost of the venue, to build a new state-of-the-art clubhouse that could lure Louisville's upper crust in for wine and dine social events. He set about forming a medium-term partnership with the Kentucky State Fair to appeal to the common man, hosting 6 straight before the construction of a permanent fairgrounds elsewhere. He went so far as to bring in concerts and auto races to bridge the gap between the lot. If they were going to fail, it wasn't going to be for a lack of trying. Winn poured everything he had into that track. All it took was all he had. Under Winn, the Derby and Churchill Downs saw a dramatic reversal of fortune. Expanded betting, fueled by a return of Clark's pari-mutuel system and a reduction in ticket price, brought vast amounts of capital back to the track. Off-season entertainment was a smash hit as well, making Churchill Downs not just a place to see, but a place to be seen, especially with its new emphasis on beautification, flooding them with still more cash. So evident was the immediate financial turnaround that the new ownership group purchased the land on which the track sat for $135,000. They couldn't use all their newfound fortune on capital projects, though. It was no secret that the on-track product had waned as owners fled the Derby while withdrawing their horses from the stables, and to sustain interest over the long term, they would need to bring those A-tier competitors back. The only way to do so, seemingly, was by spreading the wealth around. Horse owners were mostly shrewd businessmen after all, and if the value proposition was there, they too would be. Sure enough, as the purses got richer and richer, the horses got faster and faster, until the Derby was again national news. Not as a sideshow this time, though. The Derby was the main course. In 1913, it exploded. A long-shot winner, Donerail, who was locally owned, trained, and bred, ran a record speed 1.25 miles, paying out to the tune of 91-1, and riders just couldn't get enough. It was a storybook race. Even the New York Times, perhaps the most influential newspaper in the world, ran a feature. Considering the equestrian inroads Winn had been building across the country, managing and consulting with a huge number of tracks, this was the biggest victory of them all. Finally, he had the proof of concept to present to the wealthy owners and trainers of the East, who, despite owning all of the best horses, had practically refused to ever participate in the Derby. Several of New York's high society were spotted evaluating the spectacle in person the following year, a race won by local product Old Rosebud in record time and by a record margin that still stands over a century later. Though he may not have managed to convince them all of the merits of his little track in Kentucky, after all, how could he? When it was said and done, Winn hooked one of the biggest fish of all anyway. Harry Payne Whitney, a Skull and Bones member during his time at Yale, beneficiary of a $24 million inheritance and a Vanderbilt by marriage, was a walking, talking caricature of Gilded Age New York. His father was even once touted as a candidate for president with the backing of his monopolist uncle. He was Winn's white whale. Through his connections to the world's most fashionable social set and the trappings of power, his brother was son-in-law to the Secretary of State, Winn could help make the Derby a premier event for the world's 1%. And his horses weren't bad either. By 1914, Whitney had 3 times each won the Preakness and Belmont Stakes, aspirationally the Derby's 2 biggest competitors, and had a top prospect of a horse, Regret, waiting in the wings to run them in 1915. Best of all, Regret was tangentially linked to the Derby. Outside of its own accomplishments, being the only horse ever at the time to go undefeated in the 2-year-old races at Saratoga, Regret's sibling Meridian was champion of the Derby in 1911, and much of its lineage had participated at some point or another. Critically, from Winn's perspective, though, it was a girl. The media attention that would come to Churchill Downs from a first-ever filly champion, a legacy filly champion, Harry Whitney's filly champion, would be immense. He just had to hope the awestruck Whitney brought her in peak condition for 1915. And boy, did he. Regret led the race wire to wire, casually running away from the field to tack the Kentucky Derby on to her undefeated streak. It caused an even bigger media circus than there had been in 1913, thanks in no small part to the fame of Whitney and the larger-than-life persona of Winn, finally catapulting the Derby to national notoriety. Whitney remarked, "I do not care if she never wins another race, or if she ever starts in another race. She has won the greatest race in America, and I am satisfied." Perhaps he was embellishing a little to inflate the stock of his asset, but it seemed that Whitney and several of his peers really did believe it. Regret's victory was the first of 5 straight for New York-based owners. Though some of the horses still had Kentucky connections, especially through Lexington-based breeder John Madden, it represented a huge paradigm shift, whiplash to modernity. Northeastern money, as it had into so many others, flooded the Kentucky horse industry. Heirs and industrialists with more dollars than sense threw their never-ending piles of cash at colts, trainers, studs, even whole farms in Whitney's case, and ushered in an era of unprecedented financial stability for Kentucky and Churchill Downs. So much stability that it, for the first time, became a sound investment. In the immediate wake of Kentucky's horse boom, a group of investors fronted by generally Midwestern-based nouveau riche industrialist types set out to monopolize Kentucky racing. By 1918, the men had their hands on Douglas Park, Latonia, and the Kentucky Association track in Lexington, but the final jewel, Churchill Downs, proved elusive. After a months-long effort to woo the existing ownership group, they lodged a takeover bid worth $620,000, 16 times what Winn and Company had paid for it 15 years early, with only one condition. The money was off the table if Winn didn't stay on as general manager. What they didn't know was that Winn wanted to stay involved anyway. It was the only thing he had ever excelled at, and what they were offering was a preposterous return on investment, with freedom Winn hadn't known in some time. As a self-made man, it was much easier to spend other people's money than it was his own. In this environment, he took it to another stratosphere. The new owners empowered Winn to begin a new level of thorough, capital-intensive projects straight away. With nearly $300,000 of additional investment, Winn built a new grandstand, boxes, office space, even improved the landscaping to appeal to the new 1% crowd. All totaled, the new facilities could, and did, comfortably host over 50,000 paying customers a race, making it reportedly the largest such facility in the country. Though it was so successful that Winn, ironically, was given less responsibility over Churchill Downs in order to oversee all the group's tracks, he never could make it work anywhere else. As he wound towards the end of his career, his focus narrowed back to Churchill Downs, the Depression ravaging the rest of the American Turf Association's holdings, and left an indelible mark that makes him one with the track. Over the remainder of his tenure, Winn mostly constructed the spectacle of the Derby as we know it today. In the 30s, he oversaw an ambitious expansion that brought capacity over 100,000, enshrining it as the largest race in the country and possibly in the world. He ensured there was ample space for media and radio at a time where investors worried that having it broadcast would remove the incentive to attend, fundamentally misunderstanding what he had worked his whole adult life to build. The first playing of my old Kentucky home? Win. The first standardized Champions Trophy? Win. The now traditional date? Set by Winn. Its position in the Triple Crown exists because of Winn's political maneuvering. Is he part of the lasting imagery of Churchill Downs? No. Is Meriwether Lewis Clark? Not likely. Is Colonel William Whitley? Absolutely not. No, when you picture the Kentucky Derby, you might picture Secretariat striding down the back straight in record time. You might picture an underdog story, Mind That Bird hawking down the pack, Rich Strike wearing the garland of roses. You might even just picture the party. Ladies in their unmanageable hats, gentlemen in their tackiest formal wear. A majestic, debaucherous mess in the mud. The finished article doesn't provoke visions of the spinner who spun the yarn, the weaver who wove the fabric, or the tailor who stitched it all together. But without the artisans, you don't have the art. Something cheaply and hastily put together can't have the soul of 2 centuries of fine craftsmanship. That's why we so love it, despite every bit of logic saying that we should not. It's been carefully stewarded and poured into for 2 centuries, so it can be passed from father to son, mother to daughter, and all too frequently those spaces have disappeared. It's a rarity. It's one of one. That is why it's special. That is why it's the Derby.